There's a special place in hell for Jeffrey Epstein and his partner in crime and slime, Ghislaine Maxwell. If not for the tireless efforts of today's guest, Brad Edwards, and his law partner, Brittany Henderson, they might still be at it today. But because of their hard work and their dedication over a period of time more than 10 years long, and because of the personal sacrifices these two lawyers made, they are the reason that Jeffrey Epstein was taken down by them and by the government. Ghislaine Maxwell was indicted and convicted and is doing a 20-year sentence right now in federal prison. Jeffrey Epstein was clearly on his way to prison, and he committed suicide. Or did he? Brad Edwards, good morning. Say hello, and let's open up with your thoughts about whether Jeffrey Epstein's suicide was really a suicide.
Good morning, Russ. Yeah, while we still have certain clients who don't necessarily believe it, Jeffrey Epstein committed suicide. I know that for multiple reasons, not the least of which is that he actually told one of our clients before he was arrested how to commit suicide if ever in a bind, and he essentially carried out exactly his instructions.
And is that something that you mentioned to the feds when he was locked up, to watch out for that?
We told the feds to watch out for a suicide, and I don't know if you remember, but he attempted suicide about 2 weeks before he was successful, and we told him to especially watch out then. So we knew it was coming.
What were your personal thoughts when you learned that he had died in prison by his own hand?
Mixed emotions, disappointed that the government had to know that was a real possibility, that he would commit suicide, and still they allowed it to happen. So many different things had to happen for him to be able to successfully avoid justice. I think that there was a part of it that was relief, because he obviously wasn't very happy, certainly wasn't very happy with me, wasn't very happy with anyone around me, would like to have probably caused some harm to us and our clients. There was relief in that sense, but we had gone through a lot to have him arrested and wanted the day in court to prove his guilt and hold him accountable. So mixed emotions.
There's no great loss to society that he's gone, and that Ghislaine Maxwell has been taken out of circulation, and I can only think of all of the victims that never came to be or to be jeopardized by Jeffrey Epstein because of you. And I want to tell you, as we worked together on these cases very early on, but I've been watching it the whole time, and you are my hero, and I just want to tell you up front, thank you so much for coming on to the podcast and taking the time to be here. You're not an easy guy to nail down, but for the right reason.
Yeah, I'm always busy trying to do the next thing, but we had a good start with the case.
Yes. You ended up representing about 71 victims individually against Jeffrey Epstein. How many do you think there were in total?
I think in total there were probably close to 400. Going into the class action cases where we sued JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank, we had represented 71 of his victims individually. And then through those cases, we ultimately represented close to 250 of his victims. And by representing, I don't just mean in a class action sense. We actually met with them, know their story, know how they fit in the timeline and the bigger picture. But we also knew that there were probably still 100 or so out there that still haven't come forward and never will.
I always tell my coaching clients that relationships are the key, not only to getting cases, but to keeping cases. And I know that you and Brittany both had close relationships with all of the victims that you represented. Does that continue to this day, even though their cases are over?
Oh, yeah, it continues this day. We have both separately been asked to marry certain clients, like perform the wedding services. So I've done that. So has she. We're like the first call when they get married, get divorced, get a speeding ticket, whatever it is. Yeah, we stay in their lives. And in fact, right now, we just helped several of our clients to found a charity for sex trafficking and sex abuse survivors. It's called The Survivors, and it's run by our former clients and us. So it's like survivors educating other sex abuse survivors as to how to get along in the world and fulfill their needs.
That's really nice and very altruistic of both of you, so hats off to you. So Brad and Brittany are co-authors of a book called Relentless Pursuit that came out a couple of years ago, and we've got a copy sitting behind Brad on the shelf over there. Obviously, my favorite part of the book is where you mention me and my involvement with you in the original Jeffrey Epstein cases, and you're basically getting off the ground. In addition, I know that you were threatened. I know that at times you needed police protection at your home and I think at your office. I know that you were sued by Epstein. So could you just tell us a little bit more about that? Let's start with personal meetings that Epstein requested with you at a Starbucks. Tell us about that.
Sure. Well, the personal meetings started after Jeffrey Epstein sued me. So there had been this ongoing legal battle between the two of us, and then at some point in time, he realized he needed to do something somewhat desperate, but soon, to push me off of the prosecution of him. I think that he could tell that I was never going to go away. I was always in it to do right by the victims and not to really take the road that others had and let him settle his way out of it and get away with things. So I had already sued the government for violating the victim's rights by giving him a sweetheart deal. And Jeffrey Epstein thought he needed to pull all the punches to get me off him. So he sues me, and very early into that litigation, I think he sent me an email or he made a telephone call and said, look, the only way that we're going to get anything done between us is if we drop our lawyers and we're able to talk directly. And he thought that either that way he could intimidate me or use his charisma to try to convince me that he wasn't so bad. So the first meeting that we had was at a Starbucks in Boca.
Now, by way of background, I know that you started out as a prosecutor for the Broward County State Attorney's Office, and you were prosecuting violent felonies. So you had a pretty thick skin going into this, right?
I had pretty thick skin before I ever became a lawyer, and being a prosecutor, I loved prosecuting the worst people.
You've been threatened before?
Yeah, I had been threatened before, but nothing as overtly intimidating as having a billionaire like Jeffrey Epstein, who I saw had already somehow worked over the United States government to get a free pass on sexual abuse of hundreds of minors. That's not something anybody else can accomplish.
Right.
So,
and we'll get to his sweetheart deal, but talk about what he said to you, how he threatened you. How did that go?
So we had a series of meetings, but the first Starbucks meeting, he sat down and we were the same distance we are right here, and he put his phone down and said, do you want anything? Like he was going to go get coffee. And he came back to the table and said something along the lines of, were you recording me? Or, hey, I left my wallet here. Do I need to watch you? And started making like kind of jokes. It made me think his phone's probably recording me at the time, which I'm sure that it was. But then he started by trying to convince me that I was wrong and he wasn't really that bad. At some point in time in the conversation, he tried to convince me that I should back off of this American ideology that 18 years old is the age of consent, because at a much younger age, biologically, you can have children, and smart people should know that 18 years old is way too old. And so we disagreed. I said, you're not going to convince me of this. And as the conversation continued and he was trying to persuade me out of my, what he would say is like a rigid stance against his behavior, he said, you know that I have you under surveillance 24 hours a day. He said, it's unfortunate for you that it's now and not when I was in college or something more fun to watch me, you know. I live a pretty boring life these days. And he said, but I could have your family under surveillance. I could have your kids under surveillance. I can do whatever I want to. And if you continue to come at me the way that you are, somebody is going to get hurt.
And what were your thoughts when he said that to you?
I think that I had already resigned to somebody is going to get hurt. I just made up my mind that it's going to be him. He's done something wrong. I haven't. I'm doing everything in my power to just make sure that our system works, that the victims have a voice, and just stay consistent with that. It's all about the victims. It's not about me. It's all about making sure that our system works, no matter how bad the government had screwed it up. It's not about anything else. So no matter how much he intimidates me, if I back off, then what is this world? And nobody is ever going to hold this guy accountable. So that's not really an option.
Yeah, but you're sitting there and this billionaire is threatening you, and you know that he could afford to do anything or hire anyone to do anything. Did that scare you or to have concerns?
In retrospect, it probably should have. At the time, no. Because you know when you're in the battle, you're only fighting. And I think that I'm pretty good at stepping back and saying, okay, let's analyze every different angle of the situation. But retreat isn't an option. So then after you analyze it, it's get back into it and figure out how to stay safe, but also to continue to move the ball down the field. So I think that it ended with, we did not shake hands on the first encounter at the Starbucks, but I think it ended with me saying that we're going to have to agree to disagree. And I called him out on a few of his lies that he then pretended to have misremembered. But what he did realize is that I had a better handle on the record, on what he had done, what he hadn't done, what had been filed, what was true, what was not true, and could cross-examine him like right on the spot. He wasn't ready for that. So when he backed off and said, okay, I see that we still have some talking to do, but I want to keep this line of communication open, because he always wanted to think he's the smartest one in the room, and eventually he's going to be able to talk his way out of it, even with me.
So I was going to ask you, what was your take on his ego?
Off the charts, but at the same time, disarming in the sense that you could tell he was the smartest person in the room, but he would be self-deprecating when necessary, only to try to soften up whoever he was dealing with.
It calls to mind a line that I use with all of my coaching clients, and I do a lot of mindset coaching, but the line goes, your ego is not your amigo. And it sounds to me like his ego was a huge part of his undoing. He was brazen, thought he could do anything, he's a billionaire, right? Certainly not his amigo, was it?
No, of course. He really, truly did believe he was above the law, but he believed it because for many years he was above the law. If it wasn't for us just being so pestering, not only to him, but to the government, how many times I went to the government with a case telling them that they need to indict him over the years, and it failed until finally we got the attention of the right people.
He did have you under surveillance, though, and you knew about that, right? Talk about that.
I did know about that. There was one day, I think the first time that I found out, I was riding a motorcycle, and I saw a car in the rearview mirror that had followed me from the neighborhood onto the highway, off of the highway, and I thought, okay, this is obviously somebody. And I kept seeing the same car, so then I had our investigator at the time to do counter surveillance, and eventually, a couple days later, ran the license tag. It came back to an investigator. And after that, I called him out on it. When he called me on the telephone, I said, hey, look, I know that you still have me under surveillance because I'll tell you the make and model and everything in the car. And he acted like he had nothing to do with it. And then called me back later and said, oh, wait, that was my attorneys. I pay them. They do stupid things. I know that's intimidating. So I'm a nice guy. I called him off as if he did me a favor.
And you knew he was behind it the whole time.
Of course I knew he was behind it the whole time.
And he made it pretty obvious to you that you were being watched.
He told me directly numerous times that I was being watched. I mean, now, fast forward, and all I do, like our whole practice is just to mess with bad guys. Now I would have a harder time discerning who is actually following me. There'd be a lot of suspects, but at the time, I knew that it was him. And he didn't deny it.
Yeah, and I knew that he had sued you. I know you ultimately prevailed in that litigation, but I also know that early on, there was a point when you were looking at the possibility of having to pay his attorney's fees, which were, according to him, about $10 million. Now, that would stress out a lot of people. Aside from the physical threats and the surveillance, that would push some people over the edge. How did you respond to that?
It was a frustrating time because there was this body of case law, not to get into the nuance of that, but I had sued him for malicious prosecution, right? Essentially, he filed a fake lawsuit only for the purpose of intimidating me and trying to cause me to abandon the legitimate cases for my clients. He maliciously prosecuted me. I get that case dismissed. I sue him for malicious prosecution, and there was this period of time in Florida law where a certain quirky opinion came out and said that's no longer a tort in Florida. And because of that, and because of his offer of judgment, I was on the hook for approximately $10 million if we had not ultimately had that overturned at the Supreme Court. And he was, during that period of time, saying, hey, look, you're going to lose. You're going to owe me $10 million. And all you have to do, Brad, is walk away. I'll wipe the slate clean. We'll go our separate directions. Just leave me alone. But when you're so far down the road and you're doing right, leaving somebody alone and backing off just because they somehow, through legal maneuvers, reverse the field on you, it wouldn't feel right. I'd never be able to live with myself. Like, I became a lawyer to change the world. I became a lawyer to do good for clients. I became a lawyer only to go after people like that are above the law And what, now I'm going to be an enabler just because he's reversed the field on me? It wouldn't have felt that. There was never, not 1 second, that I considered doing it. Even though I knew it might bankrupt me, but still I know that I'm on the right path. I'm doing right.
On top of all the physical threats, the surveillance, the financial threat to your very livelihood, to bankrupt you, in terms of your mindset, describe it. What was your mindset at that time?
Fight harder. I was like, okay, dig deeper, find other ways. It was during that period of time was like the next time that I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office in New York and said, look, I have another trafficking case. He's still doing it to this day. I can put it together for you, because I also thought if he gets arrested for his ongoing activity and I'm able to tell the government, I told you, then it's going to be very difficult for any judge to uphold some judgment he gets against me on some legal technicality.
Right. Okay. That is an amazing mindset. It's something that I try to instill with my clients, but it's difficult. It's easier said than done. I think you're a special guy, and maybe it had a lot to do with how you were able to be so steely when it came to these things. Incidentally, one time I was threatened by someone I sued, and I freaked out about it, and I went running to Carl Carmen, my partner at the time, who was substantially older than me, and Carl's words to me were, and I'll never forget this, he goes, Russell, don't worry about the people who threaten you. It's the people who don't threaten you that you really have to worry about. And that gave me great relief.
Yeah. I also had Jack Scarola as a lawyer at the time representing me in that individual case. And Jack loved my mentality, and Jack has a similar mentality. So Jack, don't worry, I will deal with that problem. You continue to do what you're doing, representing your clients. Don't let him throw you off.
Yep.
Like always having somebody like that to tell you're doing right, stay on track, I'll take care of the noise in the background, that helps. And that's usually the role that we play as lawyers.
Yeah. Before we get farther into the Epstein case and how you and I met each other and became involved together in the Epstein cases, at least at the beginning, which was 10 to 15 years ago, I think, I just want to cover some other sex abuse cases that you handled. Before Epstein or after, a $71 million verdict against the owner of a mega yacht where your client was raped. Could you talk about that, please?
Yes, I represented Samantha Baca, which ultimately I presided over her wedding.
Oh, that's lovely.
Going into the case, typical defense mentality. The private yacht owner was represented by a big law firm in Miami. So they had offered very little to settle the case.
So how big was this yacht?
151-foot yacht.
Okay.
Samantha Baca was a crew member on the yacht, and she was living aboard the yacht with one other individual who was also a crew member from Poland, and they lived on the bottom deck. The yacht was in the water, but it was at the marina, and it was being worked on, and the captain was at the top level. This is a huge ship. And the deckhand that roomed right next to her in the bottom level had gone out for the night, gone out drinking, which was allegedly against policy, but nobody checked, came back on the boat and violently raped her.
On the boat?
On the boat. Very serious, violent rape. She was able to escape, ran out of the room, went up to the top, hid in the captain's quarters, and the bad guy was eventually arrested. So the defense was, it's the bad guy's fault. We couldn't have done anything to prevent this, which wasn't really true. The owner had no protection whatsoever in place. But I'll tell you, it should have been, in my view, it was a big case. And she's a great person and made a great witness. But it's a case where there should have been a $30 million verdict. There was a cross-examination of her by a defense lawyer that increased exponentially the value of the case. It's something that a lot of defense lawyers do in cases like this, where they're just tone deaf to the extreme injuries that are caused by sexual abuse. She says, look, I listened to your direct examination, and I'm sure that the rape was really bad. But didn't you say that on the way home from the rape treatment center that your father stopped and got you Taco Bell? Yes. If you were still able to eat, it wasn't that bad, right?
Ugh.
Now, look, I had co-counsel who had brought me in to try the case, and he was saying, Jackson, I'm going, no, we're not objecting. This is the defense increasing the value of the case, but it also was channeling the owner. It's like the owner did absolutely nothing to protect our client on the boat. And now, channeling the same nonchalant attitude of live with it, they were now victim shaming and calling into question every single action that she engaged in after this event, which was proven to have happened to her. Anytime you get a verdict, 71 million, it usually not only means you put a good case together, but somebody else on the other side did something wrong.
Angry juries return large verdicts.
Yeah,
agree?
Exactly, yes. But also, I thought, when you really put pen to paper about the degree of harm that's caused in sexual abuse and sex trafficking, and you talk about the types of damages that attach to that, and you ask a jury to fairly and fully measure the magnitude of the harm, and you walk them through their life, that number's big. It's always big.
Yep.
And the clients that I stay in touch with, 15 years ago, I knew them, and these things happened. Still today, they're dealing with that trauma. Mm-hmm. So that's also one of the reasons we started the foundation, The Survivors, was because there's plenty of people that 15 years later either didn't get money or don't have the resources, don't have anything, don't have anybody to turn to, and they still need help.
Despite the fact that you got this verdict and the owner was a billionaire, he was not easy to collect from, and you arrested his 151-foot yacht in Fort Lauderdale? Okay,
yes.
Can you just tell us about that? And for those who may not know what arresting a vessel is, explain.
Yeah, so we get a $71 million verdict, but how are you going to collect a $71 million verdict, right? The guy had, I think, $5 million of insurance, so then the only thing backing up the judgment is going to be the boat. So the boat's probably worth $20 million or so. So as soon as the verdict is read, the owner leaves the courtroom, which Brittany tried the case with me. She said, that's pretty suspicious. So that night, we called the marina where the yacht was and said, hey, what's the deal with the yacht? How long is it staying there? And they said, oh, it's leaving tomorrow morning for the Galapagos Islands. I said, oh, this is not good. So we went straight to the courthouse. First thing to the courthouse and said, look, we need to stop this. We had never arrested a vessel before. It's a very technical process that requires 6 different motions to get filed. The first 3, we hand typed and were ready to deliver. We didn't realize when you have an emergency arrest that there's 3 other motions that have to get done. Brittany actually hand wrote them in the hallway and handed them to the clerk.
Wow.
Who then got in touch with Judge Gales, a federal judge in Miami, who issued the arrest for the emergency arrest of the vessel. We went down to the marina. We were standing out there when the marshals showed up. And just before this yacht takes off, the marshals board it. We're there. I still have video of it. They board it, kick all of the crew members off, and then the vessel is ours. Now, I thought at the time, okay, the vessel's ours, now they have to pay. That's not really how it works, right? Under the Jones Act, there's a lot more to do. It opens up another case.
So the Jones Act, federal admiralty law,
yes,
dealing with vessels on navigable waterways like the Intercoastal.
Exactly.
So that's how you got to it. Okay,
right.
Keep going.
Right.
Good story.
So then it is, okay, now the yacht's yours. I'm like, excuse me? So we had to figure out what we have to do with the vessel to maintain it. You can't just leave it in your backyard. You have to maintain it, which means you have to have an engineer on it all the time. You have to make sure that mold doesn't attach to it, that it's still workable. So
dockage fees, electricity.
We held that yacht for 7 months. And in 7 months, just the fees to maintain it were over $500,000.
And where did that money come from?
We were spending every last dollar in our law firm account to hang on to that vessel. No one would give us a loan to arrest this vessel, especially because we had a $71 million verdict. The legal experts were saying you have to watch out for remittitor on appeal.
Where the court can reduce the verdict if they think it's excessive.
And we could have to retry the case on damages altogether.
But what ultimately was the verdict reduced?
No, because we settled the case. Once we convinced the other side that we are holding on to this vessel for as long as it takes, no matter what it takes, the owner then went back to the insurance company and said, listen, I want my boat. And these guys aren't letting it go. You're not going to make them go away. And so the owner came around. In fact, the owner came up to Samantha and said, I'm really sorry for what happened to you. I didn't know how bad what happened on that boat was till I listened on the trial. I'm going to make this right. Ultimately, the owner aligns with us, goes against the insurance company as well as other lawyers involved in the case, settles the case. We released his yacht. And
can you disclose the ultimate amount of that settlement?
No, confidential.
All right.
Unfortunately, it wasn't $71 million.
Okay. But it sounds like your client got compensated.
She did.
For what she went through, as much as money can compensate for something like that.
She did. And like most of our clients, she's a lifelong friend. We stay in touch with her, and she's now one of the founding members of the nonprofit charity that we started. So all good things came from it in the end.
Yep. Then there was another case you had up in Chicago against a rapper called The Game. Could you tell our listeners about that case and what happened?
We represented Priscilla. She did not go under a Jane Doe, so I'm not revealing anything. She was on a VH1 game show that was essentially like a Bachelor, where everybody was vowing for the love of famous rapper. And they would travel around from city to city. When they traveled to Chicago, The Game did something he was not supposed to do and got Priscilla out of her hotel room that night, took her to a nightclub. And while they were at the nightclub, and he was on stage performing for a crowd, he walked back to where Priscilla was in a public area, reached under her skirt, and started feeling her in ways that you shouldn't be allowed to touch somebody. So that was the case. And he did it multiple times that night. We settled with VH1. We sued The Game directly for sexual battery. I went out to California. I took his deposition, took his whole crew's deposition that showed up with him, which I actually pulled like a Russ Adler move out there.
Which one?
So I take his deposition, and he tells me, the guy that you need to talk to is my manager, Cash Jones, and he tells me about Cash Jones' involvement and why he's going to be this important witness. And so I said, where is this guy that you tell me? He said, he's in the hallway. I go, okay, great. So after I took The Game's deposition, taking kind of a play out of what you would do, I walk in the hallway and say, hey, Cash, rather than having to subpoena you, since you're here, you want to just come in and have your deposition taken? Which he had no preparation, so he's turned out to be a great witness for us in the case, but seemed like an off-the-cuff thing that you would do. So we go to trial, wrapped The Game in so many lies, because imagine, most of the show was videotaped. So then he has words to me, his answers to me, thinking I'm never going to get the videotape, but you juxtapose his answers in the videotape, the things don't match up. Once we convict him of being a massive liar, you know how that usually goes, then everything else we say about him is true. It increases our client's credibility.
Yep.
One of the pieces of information that we put in was he had 7.1 million followers on a certain social media app where he said really ugly, nasty things about our client after the sexual assault. The jury came back with a $7.1 million verdict. I don't think it was any coincidence. This is the number of people that you've defamed her to. It wasn't a defamation case, but defamed her to, and so that's the verdict. We are still, to this day, this is 7 years later, we're still collecting that $7.1 million verdict. So it's like piecemeal, we're collecting this verdict until the very end. But yeah, that was a fun trial.
So it sounds like The Game is living up to his name and playing games.
He played a service game, he played games at trial, and he continues to play hide the money game.
But I'm glad that money is coming in for your clients.
Yeah, exactly.